Hi, and welcome to this video on human resource management as part of the video series for core management concepts. In this session, we'll be looking at HRM and a number of key issues in the field, as well as what HRM is. But just before we do, I want to link what we're doing back through to the idea of Mayo's legacy and HRM as a possible development of the work of Mayo and the Hawthorne studies that you've looked at in a previous unit. So HRM today, human resource management, the function in the organisation is focused on the selection, training, performance and reward of staff, as well as the management of the labour supply. It's evolving, it kind of evolved as a result of work that Mayo did in part. So coming from the belief that looking after staff's social and personal needs can benefit the company, but it also helps companies to meet legal obligations around the treatment of staff. So it performs a number of functions, but we can certainly draw a line from the work that Mayo did in the Hawthorne studies and other related studies that started to look at the social and psychological needs of workers and the human resource management function that we see in organisations today. So as I hinted in the previous slide, HRM entails a number of different areas. The HRM department or function oversees a range of tasks that you can see on this slide, which build towards 4 organisational aims, which you can also see on this slide, and they will spearhead these, but also will engage with managers and workers across the organisation to make sure that the HRM approach, that the things that they do are related to the work that the organisation needs them to do. So if you look across the top line, you can see the rough route of an employee through an organisation and the points at which they bump into HR professionals or managers performing HR roles. So starts with human resource planning, working out what the needs are for staff in the future, and then recruitment of people, selecting the right people, orientation for them, so when they first start, getting them on board with the culture, the processes, the policies, the norms and so forth, ongoingly training them to help them bridge any skills gaps and to do skills development, evaluating their performance and helping them to take corrective action if necessary, providing compensation and benefits for the work that they've done, helping them to develop their career in various different ways, perhaps again through training, but also coaching, or mentoring or anything else that they might use for career development, and then finally decruitment or offboarding someone when their career at a company comes to an end. So how does HRM add value then? We know it's there, but why do companies bother doing it rather than just ignoring all this stuff? Well, it's a common belief that having a great HR function can add value to an organisation, but we need to know whether this is actually true or not. First, we need to understand what adding value means. It means that you put the company in a better financial position than it would have been without the intervention. So in this case, are companies with great HR functions better performing than companies who are largely the same without great HR functions? In a study of more than 2,000 global firms, the conclusion was reached that people-centered HRM, so HRM as we're thinking about it, creates superior shareholder value. So yes, HRM does have a positive impact. And there are a range of individual HRM practices that have been shown to add value directly or indirectly. And some of these we've already covered, others you will bump into later in the course. So firstly, training managers and employees setting smart goals can help to improve employee performance. So that might be something that that the HR department are involved in when they are doing performance management or helping managers to do performance management. Also ensuring perceived equality between employees, that can increase motivation and engagement. Jobs that are high in skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy and feedback are more likely to create employee satisfaction, motivation, job performance and retention. So again, a clear link between the work that the HR function might do and the outcome of the employee career journey and satisfaction and performance. And finally, we've also seen how desirable skills of managers which add value at Google may be applied elsewhere and could include being a good coach and good communicator. And again, this is something the HR function could help with. So these are just 4 examples. There are zillions of others as you go through this module and your many other modules. Have a think about how HRM can help to add value to organisations. What it can also be said is that the real value from using particular interventions or approaches as an HR function, the real value comes from combining those. The more you do, as long as they're in line with one another, the better your organisation is likely to perform. So real value appears to arise from combining multiple HR practices together. Their combination is far more valuable than their use alone. Individual HR practices alone don't drive better business performance. Not much good just having highly skilled individuals with valuable human capital. You can only use those amazing people if they've got positive relationships with their managers, if they've got a supportive environment, if it's got strong values and so forth. So you need lots of different components for an HR practice to be valuable. Ulrich said that the HR function has 3 core activities that help a company be exceptional. The first is providing shared services, and this is performing the basic administrative tasks that are required when you're managing a workforce. So rather than leaving these tasks with individual managers, centralizing them in an HR function through payroll, absence control, employee information, and so forth, allows expert administrators to handle those and free up management time, as well as making sure that the records collected in the tasks that are undertaken are done so properly. And an HR department will be seen to be performing well in this regard if it's timely in its provision of the services and isn't overly expensive. So they're the 2 tests that a company will run to check that the HR function is, in that sense, adding value. Secondly, Ulrich says that the HR function can be a centre of expertise, with HR playing a role in supporting and advising line managers in their people management roles. So providing literally expertise on how to manage, train, retain, select, reward, performance manage people. It could be legal compliance as well, it could be employee relations, it could even be the termination of contracts. So using the HR expertise that is centered in the HR function to make sure the company is doing the best it can. And then finally, business partnerships. This is where HR work with high-level line management. So for example, the senior management team and the board of directors to improve firm performance through initiatives that are inherently more strategic. So for example, if a strategic priority for a university is to run online programs, as it has become for LSE, then HR can assist in developing strategic plans to recruit, train and retain the right sort of staff who like this kind of work, who are skilled at it and who are capable of being further trained and developed in this regard. Another way that we can think about the value that HRM can provide for companies is that for HR to add value, there needs to be a decent fit between organisational objectives and HRM practices. So there are 3 types of fit that are important. The first is internal fit. So HRM practices need to be related to one another and work in conjunction with one another. So for example, having appropriate training plans for graduate recruits to fit your particular setting, all of these things need to go together. Secondly, organisational fit. So if your company has spent lots of money developing new technology, you need to make sure you recruit people that have the ability to learn how to use it. There's no much good if the recruitment and that development don't work together. And then finally, strategic fit. So HRM practices need to be aligned with the organisation's strategy to have their full effect on performance. So you need HR policies that back up where the organisation wants to go. So if, for example, the organisation wants to be really strong on learning, you need an HR function that is really focused on training and development. So HRM practices then, they have quite significant value to a manager. Firstly, adopting a practice or set of practices employed by a successful competitor won't guarantee success. So for it to be valuable to a manager or to an organisation, it's got to be right for your setting. You've got to have a good strategic fit, as per the research of Wall and Wood on the previous slide. So as a manager then, you have to really make sure that the HR policies, HR things that you're using, that you're agreeing to use with the HR function fit, and to make sure that they are successful for you, that you're not just copying them from a competitor. Secondly, you need to pay attention as a manager to the important work that HR can do in terms of managing people and adding value. So some managers just choose to ignore HR or not to engage them properly, but actually spending effort on learning those HR skills yourselves and also working very closely with HR so that they can provide expertise for you will be really good. And it's a really critical element of the contemporary managerial role. So what's expected of managers today, as you saw in the Garvin and Google research that we covered in the earlier units. And it's a function that a considerable body of relevant theory can help with. So recognizing what makes for good HR practice and then going ahead and doing that. Okay, so we've looked then at what HR is and how it can add value, and a number of models in that regard that you'll need to understand in a decent amount of detail to perform well in the exam. We're now going to look at one final topic in relation to HRM, and that is the psychological contract. And we're looking at this because students often find it quite difficult. So it's another way of hearing about it alongside whatever you've read or what your tutor has talked to you about. So the psychological contract is different to the formal contract. When you start a job, you will get a physical or digital contract that will say what is expected of you and what you can expect of the company. So this kind of formal contract that contains mutual expectations. Alongside this, and not in any way created by the company or created by you, there's this unwritten psychological contract filled with unwritten, often unverbalized, you might not even have thought through them clearly, expectations that you build up of the employment relationship before you start and during the time that you work at a company. So an example of the difference between the two then, a written employment contract with a marketing firm could say that a worker is expected to be in the office from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. But then in your interview, a potential new recruit might be told informally that most people actually work from home on a Friday and tend to finish around 4 o'clock on that day. So the employment formal contract says one thing, but the worker has been told another, and so their psychological contract starts to contain the expectation that they'll usually be able to work from home and finish early on a Friday. So the psychological contract with their employer on this particular element looks already very different to their employment contract before they've even started. And then over time, if they decide to work for the company, the worker's going to build up more and more expectations about what they can expect from the employer and what the employer expects from them, both socially and economically. So what are you going to get? What are you going to put in? What's going to come about as return? And the psychological contract evolves ongoingly. So you'll continually add to this without realizing it, based on communication, assumptions, and so forth between the employer and the staff member. So maybe promises of a promotion or of a salary increase or of time off or recognition in some other way could form part of the psychological contract. If we just use a different example for a moment, one secretary at a company with 9 to 5 hours, again, we're looking at working hours, usually chooses to work until around 6 p.m. One evening she leaves at 5 and a colleague asks, "Did Mary leave early today?" So she's established a pattern of behaviour that's developed expectations of her performance from her colleagues, and the written contract requirements that she had have now been overwritten by practice. So we can then think about managing expectations, because it's a key task for HR managers and line managers. They don't accidentally give employees the wrong perception of what they can expect from the organisation that they're working for. Because if those expectations then didn't materialise, it could damage the relationship, even potentially severely, between the worker and the firm, as the worker gets disgruntled with the way that they feel they've been treated by the company and the breach of their psychological contract. The same's true around the other way as well. Workers need to manage the firm's expectations of them, usually via their line manager. And if they can't meet the expectations that grow around them, this can be then taken as a forgivable error as opposed to a severe breach of the psychological contract. So for example, saying, "I wouldn't normally miss a deadline, but this is a really extenuating circumstances." Because breaches of the psychological contract can severely damage the relationship between firm and employee. They can lead to demotivation, disengagement, reduced productivity, destructive behaviour, and exit, so someone choosing to leave. And a repeated breach can generate a shift back towards a transactional contract. What we mean by that is people just go back to working with the formal contract, doing what that says and doing absolutely no more. So an employer might successfully align psychological contracts in terms of what they feel it's okay for a worker to expect of them is the same as what the worker expects, but they can only expect to achieve business as usual outcomes as a result. So in other words, being aligned isn't sufficient to motivate, it just prevents dissatisfaction and problems from workers. So evaluating the psychological contract then, research on the psychological contract focuses almost singularly or unilaterally on the employee. So it's mainly about the way that the employee builds up expectations of the employer. That's not to say that it doesn't exist around the other way, because an employer does build up the sense of a psychological contract with an employee, but there's little understanding of whether it's the company that experiences a breach, or whether it's the manager who would actually feel that breach, how they would feel it, what might happen as a result. And the difficulty here is perhaps because we're discussing a psychological process, and psychology occurs within an individual in relation to the abstract entity of a firm. So you can't have the psychology of a firm, really. We couldn't hope to understand that. But we could look at how a manager experiences a sense that an employee has violated their expectations, but we don't have research which has looked at that at this point in time. So why then is this idea of psychological contract important for managers? What are the implications? Firstly, it's a valuable tool. It's a valuable concept because employees place a wide range of expectations on employers, not just economic, and managers should be aware of that, because the implications of breaching them can be really severe and really jeopardize that relationship with that particular employee. And the HR function and line management have really important roles to play in engaging with employees to help shape perceptions about what that psychological contract contains. And then line managers have a further important role to play because they need to gain insight into and help manage employees' expectations when they're working closely with them. From a firm perspective, though, some breaches of the employment contract, of the psychological contract, will be unavoidable. So, for example, in an economic downturn, it might lead to a company having to reduce bonuses and training budgets, but companies that handle this with perceived fairness and honesty and openness have been shown to successfully reduce the impact compared to those which don't. And that's it in terms of this particular mini lecture. I hope you'll join me in the future lectures that I will be giving for core management concepts. Thanks for listening.